I never expected 3 simple words to shatter everything I thought I knew about loneliness. When my neighbor Sydney Jameson asked me to fix her garden sprinkler system, I figured it would be just another weekend favor. 30 minutes, maybe? An hour of my time. I had no idea that by the end of that afternoon, this elegant, seemingly composed woman would look me straight in the eyes and whisper the most heartbreaking confession I'd ever heard. "I'm 53 and haven't been touched in years." Those words didn't just hang in the air between us. They changed the entire course of both our lives in ways neither of us could have predicted. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Let me back up and tell you how this all started, because the story of Sydney and me isn't what you'd expect. It's messier, more complicated, and somehow more beautiful than anything I could have imagined when I first moved to Maplewood Heights. My name is Marcus Carter, and I'm 29 years old. I work as a landscaper and handyman in this quiet Colorado suburb where the houses are well maintained, the lawns are pristine, and most people keep to themselves. I've always been the type who fixes things: broken fences, clogged gutters, stubborn lawnmowers. It's what I do, and honestly, it's what I'm good at. There's something satisfying about taking something that's broken and making it work again. Something that makes sense in a world that often doesn't. I moved to Maplewood Heights about 8 months ago, renting a small house on Elm Street after my last relationship fell apart, and I needed a fresh start. The neighborhood is the kind of place where people wave from their driveways, but don't necessarily know each other's last names. Everyone seems content with their perfectly spaced privacy, their identical mailboxes, and their weekend routines of grocery shopping and yard work. That's where Sydney comes in. Sydney Jameson lived 3 houses down from me in a beautiful 2-story colonial with dark blue shutters and the most immaculate flower beds I'd ever seen. From the outside, everything about her life looked perfect. The kind of put-together existence that magazine photographers would use for suburban lifestyle shoots. She drove a silver sedan that was always spotless. Her grass was always perfectly trimmed, and she maintained her property with an attention to detail that honestly intimidated me a little. I'd see her occasionally when I was working in my own yard or coming home from jobs. She'd be out tending to her roses or retrieving her mail, always dressed nicely even for simple tasks. Never the ratty t-shirts and paint-stained jeans that were my usual uniform. She seemed like the type of woman who had her life completely figured out, someone who probably had a successful career, a wide social circle, and the kind of confidence that comes from knowing exactly where you belong in the world. We'd exchange the usual neighborly pleasantries. "Good morning." "Nice weather we're having. Have a great weekend," but nothing more substantial than that. She struck me as polite but distant, friendly enough but clearly not interested in developing any real connections with the neighbors. I respected that. Not everyone wants to be best friends with the people who happen to live nearby. But there were small things I noticed over the months that didn't quite fit the perfect picture. Like how she never seemed to have visitors on weekends, or how her outdoor furniture looked brand new, as if it had never actually been used. Sometimes I'd see her sitting alone on her back patio in the evenings, a glass of wine in her hand, staring out at her garden with an expression I couldn't quite read. It wasn't sadness exactly, but it wasn't contentment either. It was something more like emptiness. I probably wouldn't have thought much more about Sydney Jameson if it hadn't been for that Saturday morning in late September when everything changed. I was working in my garage, organizing tools and trying to fix an old leaf blower that had been giving me trouble, when I heard a soft knock on my open garage door. I looked up to find Sydney standing there, looking slightly uncomfortable but determined. She was wearing dark jeans and a cream-colored sweater, her blonde hair pulled back in a neat ponytail, and she had that particular expression people get when they're about to ask for a favor they're not sure they should be asking for. "Marcus?" she said, her voice carrying a slight tremor of uncertainty. "I'm sorry to bother you, but I was wondering if you might be able to help me with something." I set down my wrench and wiped my hands on a rag, surprised by how nervous she seemed. This was a woman who always appeared completely in control, but standing in my garage doorway, she looked almost vulnerable. "Of course," I said, walking over to her. "What's going on?" She tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, a gesture that seemed oddly girlish for someone so polished. "It's my sprinkler system," It's been acting up for weeks, and I finally called a repair company, but they can't come out for another 2 weeks. I know you do landscaping work, and I thought maybe—" She trailed off, looking embarrassed. "I'm sorry, this is presumptuous of me. You barely know me, and here I am asking for favors." "Not presumptuous at all," I assured her, grabbing my toolbox. "That's what neighbors are for, right? Let's take a look." As we walked toward her house, I noticed how she kept glancing at me sideways, as if she was trying to figure something out. The morning air was crisp and carried the scent of autumn leaves and her perfume, something light and floral that seemed to suit her perfectly. "I really appreciate this," she said as we reached her backyard. "I tried watching YouTube videos, but I think I might have made it worse." I smiled at that, imagining this perfectly composed woman wrestling with sprinkler heads and getting frustrated. "With online tutorials. Trust me, sprinkler systems can be tricky even for professionals. Don't worry about it." What I didn't know then was that this simple request for help would be the first thread in unraveling a story far more complex and heartbreaking than I could have imagined. As I knelt down to examine her irrigation system that morning, I had no idea that I was about to become part of something that would challenge everything I thought I knew about loneliness, connection, and what it really means to help someone heal. The sprinkler repair was just the beginning. Sydney's backyard was even more impressive up close than it had appeared from a distance. Every plant seemed deliberately placed, every flower bed perfectly mulched, every pathway swept clean of even the smallest debris. It was the kind of garden that belonged in a home and lifestyle magazine. But as I knelt down to examine the malfunctioning sprinkler system, I couldn't shake the feeling that something about all this perfection felt almost desperate. "The problem started about 3 weeks ago," Sydney explained, hovering nearby as I checked the first sprinkler head. "The system would turn on, but only some of the zones were working. Then last week, this section completely stopped, and now I think I've flooded that corner over there trying to fix it myself." I looked where she was pointing and saw a slightly muddy patch near her prize roses, evidence of her unsuccessful repair attempts. There was something endearing about imagining this polished woman getting her hands dirty and frustrated with stubborn irrigation equipment. "Let me guess," I said, unscrewing the faulty sprinkler head. "You turned the water pressure up thinking, that would help?" She laughed, but it was a sound tinged with embarrassment. "Guilty as charged. I may have also hit one of the heads with a small gardening shovel when it wouldn't cooperate." "Ah, the percussive maintenance approach," I grinned. "Classic move. We've all been there." As I worked, replacing a clogged filter and adjusting the water pressure, Sydney sat down on a nearby garden bench. From this angle, I could see the exhaustion in her shoulders, the way she seemed to deflate slightly when she thought I wasn't looking. The perfectly maintained facade was slipping, just a little. "You have incredible gardens," I said, trying to make conversation as I moved to the next problematic zone. "How long have you been working on all this?" "About 5 years," she replied, quietly. "I started it after—" She paused, and I could feel the weight of unfinished words hanging in the air. "After my divorce was finalized, I needed something to focus on, something I could control." There it was, the first real piece of personal information she'd shared. A divorce. That explained the lack of visitors, the too-perfect house, the sense of someone trying very hard to fill empty spaces. "Gardening can be therapeutic," I said, carefully, not wanting to push too hard. "There's something satisfying about nurturing something and watching it grow." "Exactly," she said, and I heard genuine warmth in her voice for the first time. "My ex-husband used to say it was a waste of time and money. He preferred things that showed immediate results. New cars, expensive gadgets, anything that impressed." "The neighbors," she gestured toward her flowers. "But these take patience. They teach you to appreciate small changes, daily progress." I found the main problem, a broken valve that had been causing the pressure issues, and began replacing it. "Sounds like your ex-husband missed the point entirely." Sydney was quiet for a moment, watching me work. "Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us." Now back to the story. He missed a lot of points, actually. The way she said it made me look up. There was pain in her expression, but also something like relief, as if she was finally allowing herself to acknowledge truths she'd kept buried. "How long were you married?" I asked gently. 15 years. The words came out flat, matter of fact. We were high school sweethearts, got married young, and I spent most of my adult life trying to be the wife he wanted me to be. Turns out, no version of me was ever going to be enough. I focused on the valve replacement, giving her space to share or not share as much as she wanted. Sometimes people need to talk, and sometimes they just need someone nearby who won't judge them for their silence. I threw myself into this house, this garden, after he left, she continued. I told myself I was creating something beautiful, something just for me. But lately, I've been wondering if I'm just hiding. The honesty in her voice caught me off guard. This wasn't the polished, put-together woman I'd thought I knew. This was someone who was questioning everything about her life, someone who was brave enough to say difficult truths out loud. From what? I asked, testing the repaired valve. From the fact that I don't really know who I am when I'm not trying to be perfect for someone else. She laughed, but there was no humor in it. I'm 53 years old, and I feel like I'm just figuring out that I've been playing a character my entire adult life. I sat back on my heels, looking at the woman sitting on the bench surrounded by her beautiful, carefully controlled garden. That takes courage to admit. Does it? Because mostly, it just feels terrifying. The irrigation system was nearly fixed, but I found myself moving slower, not wanting this conversation to end. There was something about Sydney's willingness to be vulnerable that made me want to share something real in return. I know something about starting over, I said, moving to the final problematic sprinkler head. I moved here 8 months ago after my life basically imploded. Lost my job, lost my girlfriend, lost my sense of direction all within the span of about 6 weeks. Some days I still feel like I'm just pretending to have my act together. She turned to look at me, really look at me, as if seeing me clearly for the first time. You seem so grounded, confident, like you know exactly what you're doing. I laughed, a genuine sound this time. I'm good at fixing broken things. People assume that means I have my own life figured out, but honestly, most days I'm just trying to stay busy enough that I don't have to think too hard about where I'm heading. At least you're honest about it, she said softly. I've been pretending everything is fine for so long that I sometimes forget it's an act. The last sprinkler head clicked into place, and I turned on the system to test it. Water arced perfectly across each section of her garden, soaking the carefully tended plants and filling the air with the fresh scent of wet earth. There you go, I said, standing up and brushing dirt off my knees. Should work perfectly now. Sydney stood too, watching the water dance across her flowers. Thank you. Really. I can't tell you how much I appreciate this. Happy to help, I said, gathering my tools. And Sydney? For what it's worth, I think you're being too hard on yourself. Building something beautiful isn't hiding, it's hope. She smiled then, the first completely unguarded smile I'd seen from her. Maybe you're right. As I headed toward my toolbox, Sydney called out softly, "Marcus?" I turned back to her. "Would you like some coffee? I mean, if you're not too busy. I feel like I should offer you something after you spent your whole morning fixing my mistakes." There was something fragile in the invitation, as if she was taking a small but significant risk. I realized this might be the first time in months, maybe years, that she'd invited someone into her space just because she wanted the company. Coffee. Sounds perfect, I said, and watched her shoulders relax with relief. Walking toward her back door, I had no idea that accepting that simple invitation would change everything. But as Sydney held the door open for me, something shifted between us. A recognition that we were both tired of pretending to be fine. Both ready to let someone else see the real, imperfect people behind our carefully constructed facades. The sprinkler system was fixed, but our story was just beginning. Sydney's kitchen was as meticulously organized as her garden. Granite countertops free of clutter, everything in its proper place. But somehow it felt more lived in than I'd expected. A half-finished crossword puzzle lay folded beside a coffee mug with lipstick traces on the rim, and I could see a small stack of books on the counter, their spines worn from repeated reading. These tiny imperfections made the space feel human, real. "I hope you don't mind strong coffee," she said, moving with practiced efficiency as she prepared a fresh pot. "I've never mastered the art of making it weak." "Strong is perfect," I replied, taking a seat at her small breakfast table. Through the window, I could see the sprinkler system I'd just repaired working flawlessly, water arcing gracefully across her flower beds. As we waited for the coffee to brew, Sydney seemed to wrestle with something. She kept opening her mouth as if to speak, then closing it again, her fingers drumming nervously against the counter. Finally, she took a deep breath. "Marcus, can I ask you something personal?" "Of course." "When you said your life imploded 8 months ago, what happened? I mean, you don't have to tell me if you don't want to, but—" She trailed off, looking embarrassed. "I'm sorry, that's too personal. I barely know you." I considered deflecting, giving her some sanitized version of events, but something about her earlier vulnerability made me want to be honest. "Actually, it might help to talk about it. I haven't really told anyone the whole story since I moved here." The coffee maker finished with a soft beep, and Sydney poured 2 steaming mugs, adding cream to hers and sliding mine across the table black, somehow intuiting that's how I'd prefer it. "I was working for a large landscaping company in Denver," I began, wrapping my hands around the warm mug. "Had been there for 6 years, worked my way up to crew supervisor. I thought I was building something stable, you know? I was with a woman named Rachel. We'd been together for 3 years, talking about marriage, looking at houses." Sydney settled into the chair across from me, her attention completely focused on my words. "Then one day, Rachel came home and told me she'd been having an affair with her boss for the past 8 months. Said she'd been trying to work up the courage to leave me but couldn't figure out how to do it without hurting me." I laughed, but there was no humor in it, as if the 8 months of lying hadn't already done that. "Oh, Marcus," Sydney said, softly. "I'm so sorry." "The worst part wasn't even the betrayal," I continued. "It was realizing that I'd been so focused on work, on building what I thought was our future, that I'd completely missed the signs that she was unhappy. She said I'd become distant, that I cared more about my projects than our relationship. And honestly, she wasn't entirely wrong." Sydney reached across the table and briefly touched my hand, a simple gesture that somehow conveyed more understanding than words could. 2 weeks after Rachel left, the landscaping company lost their biggest contract due to some political maneuvering I didn't see coming. They had to lay off half the staff, including me. Suddenly I was unemployed, single, and questioning everything. "I thought I knew about building a life. That's why you came here?" I nodded. "I had some savings, and I needed to get away from all the reminders. Maplewood Heights seemed like the kind of place where I could start over, figure out who I was when I wasn't trying to be someone else's idea of successful." Sydney was quiet for a moment, processing my story. When she spoke, her voice was thoughtful. "It's funny how we can spend years building a life and then suddenly realize we don't recognize ourselves in it." "Is that what happened to you?" She sighed, staring into her coffee as if it might contain answers. "In a way, yes. But my situation was different. More gradual, I suppose." I waited, sensing she needed time to find the right words. "My ex-husband, David, was very successful, a corporate lawyer with political ambitions. When we met in high school, I was planning to study art in college, maybe become a teacher. But David had such clear ideas about the kind of life he wanted, the kind of wife he needed to achieve his goals." She paused, a bitter smile crossing her lips. "I was young and in love, and I thought changing myself for someone meant that's what love was supposed to be." "What kind of changes?" "Everything, really. The way I dressed, the friends I had, the interests I pursued. David needed a wife who could host dinner parties for his clients, who looked good at political fundraisers, who never embarrassed him by saying the wrong thing or wearing the wrong outfit." She shook her head. "I became so good at being what he needed that I completely lost track of what I needed." The pain in her voice was palpable, and I found myself angry at a man I'd never met. "For 15 years, I played the perfect political wife. I gave up art completely. David said it was a hobby that made me seem frivolous. I learned to make conversation about things I didn't care about with people I didn't like. I became an expert at standing beside him, smiling at exactly the right moments, never drawing attention away from him. That sounds exhausting. It was. But the worst part was how good I became at it. I started to believe that version of myself was the real me, that I was actually happier being someone else's accessory than pursuing my own dreams. Sydney stood up and moved to the window, looking out at her garden. The marriage started falling apart about 3 years ago. David's political career stalled, and he blamed me for not being the right kind of asset. Said I was getting older, less impressive at events, that I embarrassed him by not knowing enough about his work. Her voice grew harder. The irony was that after years of making myself into exactly what he wanted, he decided I still wasn't enough. How did it end? He had an affair with a campaign manager 20 years younger than me. When I confronted him, he said it was my fault for becoming boring and letting myself go. She turned back to me, and I could see the old hurt still sharp in her eyes. The divorce was finalized 2 years ago. I got the house and half of everything else, but I realized I had no idea who I was anymore. I felt a surge of protectiveness toward this woman who'd been systematically erased by someone who was supposed to love her. Sydney, you know none of that was your fault, right? She returned to her seat, wrapping her hands around her coffee mug as if seeking warmth. Intellectually, yes, but emotionally, I still struggle with it. Sometimes I catch myself wondering if he was right, if I really am boring and unremarkable. That's the furthest thing from the truth I can imagine. You barely know me, she said with a sad smile. I know you created something beautiful in that garden. I know you were brave enough to ask for help when you needed it. I know you just shared something incredibly personal with a virtual stranger because you sensed I needed to not feel alone in my own struggles. I leaned forward. That's not boring, Sydney. That's extraordinary. For the first time since she'd started telling her story, she looked directly into my eyes. You really believe that? I do. We sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, the weight of our shared confessions settling between us. Outside, I could hear children playing in a nearby yard, the sound of normal suburban life continuing around us while we sat in her kitchen confronting the ways our lives had been broken and rebuilt. Can I tell you something that I haven't told anyone else? Sydney asked suddenly. Of course. Sometimes I sit in this house, surrounded by all these beautiful things I've collected, and I feel like I'm disappearing, like I'm becoming invisible even to myself. Her voice dropped to almost a whisper. I'm 53 years old, and I feel like I'm just fading away. The raw honesty of her words hit me like a physical blow. This accomplished, beautiful woman genuinely believed she was becoming invisible, and I realized that in some ways, she was right. She'd been so thoroughly erased by her marriage that she was still struggling to remember how to exist as herself. Sydney, I said carefully, what would it look like if you stopped fading? What would it look like if you became more visible instead? She considered this, her brow furrowed in concentration. I honestly don't know. It's been so long since I've thought about what I want, as opposed to what I should want, that I'm not sure I remember how. Maybe that's where we start, I suggested. Maybe we figure it out together. The way she looked at me then, surprised, hopeful, a little scared, told me that this conversation had shifted something fundamental between us. We weren't just neighbors anymore. We were two people who'd recognized something essential in each other. Two people who were tired of being invisible and ready to help each other remember how to be seen. Over the following weeks, something beautiful and unexpected began to unfold between Sydney and me. What had started as a neighborly favor, fixing a broken sprinkler system, had quietly evolved into the most genuine friendship I'd experienced in years. Neither of us had planned it, but somehow we'd found ourselves drawn to each other's company, in ways that felt both natural and necessary. Our morning coffee routine became sacred. Most days when I wasn't working an early job, I'd find myself walking towards Sydney's house around 8 o'clock, drawn by the promise of good conversation and the warmth of someone who actually listened when I spoke. Sydney would have fresh coffee ready, and we'd sit either at her kitchen table or on her back patio, talking about everything from books to neighborhood gossip to our shared observations about life. Have you noticed? Sydney said one crisp October morning, pointing toward Mrs. Kellerman's house, that she's been creating entire theatrical productions with her Halloween decorations? Yesterday, the skeleton was conducting a zombie orchestra. Today, they're all having what appears to be a formal dinner party. I nearly choked on my coffee laughing. You think she's writing scripts for them? I'm convinced of it. Next week, I expect to see a full musical production starring that vampire in the top hat. These conversations revealed layers of Sydney I never could have imagined. Beneath her carefully maintained exterior was a sharp wit, an artist's eye for detail, and a surprisingly playful sense of humor that made even mundane observations feel like discoveries. She noticed things. The way morning light changed the color of her roses, how our neighbors' routines told stories about their lives, the small daily dramas that most people missed entirely. But it wasn't just Sydney's humor that drew me to our morning talks. She had a genuine curiosity about my work that no one had ever shown before. When I mentioned struggling with a particularly challenging drainage project, she surprised me by walking me through her backyard to show me how she'd solved a similar problem. "See this terraced section?" she said, pointing to an elegantly crafted series of stone walls. It took me 4 attempts to get the water flow right. The first 3 times I ended up with either a swamp or a desert, nothing in between. I was impressed not just by the technical skill, but by her willingness to experiment and learn from failure. "Where did you learn to do this?" "Trial and error mostly, and YouTube tutorials at 2 in the morning when I couldn't sleep," she admitted, with a self-deprecating smile. Turns out insomnia and home improvement projects go surprisingly well together. As our friendship deepened, I began to notice subtle changes in Sydney. The rigid perfection of her appearance softened. She'd answer the door in gardening clothes with dirt under her fingernails, or with her hair in a messy ponytail that somehow made her look younger and more alive. She started talking about small adventures she was taking, trying a new recipe, visiting an art supply store, even considering taking a pottery class at the community center. "I bought watercolors yesterday," she confessed one morning, looking almost embarrassed. "I haven't painted since college, but I keep thinking about trying to capture those sunrise colors over the mountains." "That's not embarrassing. That's exciting," I told her. "What's embarrassing is spending 20 years not doing something that used to bring you joy." The way she looked at me then, surprised, grateful, a little amazed, made me realize how long it had been since anyone had encouraged her interests rather than dismissing them. But not everyone in Sydney's orbit was pleased with our developing friendship. About a month into our coffee routine, I was leaving her house one morning when I nearly collided with a tall, sharply dressed woman marching up the front walkway with obvious purpose and barely concealed disapproval. "Excuse me," she said, her voice carrying the kind of authority that expected immediate compliance. "Are you the handyman?" Something about her tone, dismissive, condescending, immediately put me on the defensive. "I'm Marcus Carter, and you are?" "Nella Kent," she replied, as if the name should carry weight. "Sydney's former sister-in-law. I was in the neighborhood and thought I'd check on how she's managing." I could hear Sydney's footsteps behind me, and when I glanced back, I saw that all the color had drained from her face. "Nella," Sydney said carefully, her voice suddenly guarded. "This is unexpected." "I'm sure it is," Nella replied, her gaze moving between Sydney and me with obvious calculation. "I can see you're keeping busy with various projects around the house." The way she said projects made it sound like something unsavory. "Marcus has been helping with some repairs," Sydney explained, though I noticed she didn't mention our morning conversations or the friendship that had developed between us. "How fortunate," Nella said dryly. "Well, I won't keep you from your maintenance work." After Nella left, the easy comfort of our morning routine felt strained. Sydney was quieter than usual, her shoulders tense with the weight of unspoken concerns. "She doesn't approve," Sydney said finally, staring into her coffee cup. "Of what?" "Of you. Of me having any kind of friendship with someone your age. Of me not being properly grateful for my solitary existence." Sydney's fingers traced nervous patterns on the table. "Nella always believed I should consider myself lucky that David kept me for as long as he did." "And what do you believe?" Sydney was quiet for a long moment, wrestling with something deeper than just family disapproval. "I believe I spent too many years caring about what people like Nella thought about my choices. But breaking old habits is harder than I expected." I could see the doubt creeping back into her eyes, the confidence I'd watched her slowly build. starting to waver under the pressure of external judgment. "Sydney," I said gently, "do you value our friendship?" "Yes," she answered without hesitation. "More than you know." "Do you think there's anything wrong with two neighbors getting to know each other over coffee and conversation?" "No, of course not." "Then Nella's opinion is irrelevant." She smiled for the first time since Nella's arrival. Small, but genuine. "You make it sound so simple." It is simple. The complicated part is learning to ignore the voices that try to convince you otherwise. The encounter with Nella had shaken something loose in Sydney, and over the following days, I found myself looking for ways to show her that our friendship wasn't fragile or conditional, that she mattered in ways that went beyond convenience or proximity. When I discovered she'd never been to the Saturday farmers market downtown, I suggested we go together. "I've driven past it countless times," she admitted, as we walked through the entrance gates. "But I always assumed it was for families, for couples, for people with normal lives. Not for women like me." "Women like you?" She gestured vaguely at herself with a self-deprecating expression. "Middle-aged divorcees shopping alone. It feels like wearing a sign that says, 'My life didn't turn out the way I planned.'" I stopped walking and turned to face her directly. "Sydney, you're talking about yourself like you're some kind of failure. You're a woman who's rebuilding her life on her own terms after surviving a marriage that tried to erase who you are. That's not failure, that's triumph." We spent the morning wandering between vendor stalls, sampling fresh bread, examining winter vegetables, and talking to farmers about their growing techniques. I watched Sydney gradually transform as her natural curiosity emerged. She asked thoughtful questions about organic farming methods, debated the merits of different heirloom tomato varieties, and exchanged contact information with a local artist who sold hand-thrown pottery. "Thank you," she said as we loaded her purchases into my truck. "I haven't felt this connected to the world in years." "What do you mean?" "Like a real person with genuine interests and opinions, not just someone going through the motions of having a life." That afternoon, Sydney insisted on cooking lunch using her farmer's market finds. As she moved around her kitchen, chopping vegetables with practiced skill, seasoning a soup that filled the house with incredible aromas, I saw glimpses of the woman she must have been before her marriage began wearing her down. She was confident, creative, completely in her element. "David never allowed me to cook," she said, adding fresh herbs to the simmering pot. "He said it was beneath our social position to cook when we could afford restaurants and catering for everything. But I love this. The colors, the smells, the alchemy of transforming simple ingredients into something nourishing. This smells incredible. Where did you learn to cook like this?" "My grandmother," Sydney replied, her expression growing wistful. "She lived with us when I was young, and she taught me that cooking was an act of love, for yourself and for the people you care about. I haven't cooked for anyone in years." As we sat down to eat the meal she'd prepared, Sydney's phone rang. She glanced at the caller ID and her face immediately tensed with a familiar anxiety. "I should take this," she said apologetically. "It's Rosalie." I'd heard Sydney mention her daughter a few times, but always in passing and always with a complicated mix of love and sadness. I gathered that their relationship was strained, though Sydney had never explained the details. "Hi, sweetie," Sydney answered, her voice automatically brightening in that particular way people use when they're trying to sound better than they feel. "How are things?" I could hear the sharp, impatient voice on the other end, though I couldn't make out specific words. Sydney's shoulders gradually hunched as the conversation progressed, her body language shifting from hopeful to defensive. "No, I'm not dating anyone," Sydney said, and I realized with a start that this conversation was about me. Someone had told Rosalie about our friendship. "Marcus is just a neighbor who's been helping with some household repairs." More sharp words from the phone. Sydney moved toward the window, turning away from me as if that could provide privacy from a conversation I was obviously part of. "Rosalie, that's not fair," Sydney said quietly, her voice carrying a note of pleading. "I'm allowed to have friends. I'm allowed to have a life that doesn't revolve around apologizing for existing." The conversation continued for several more minutes, with Sydney mostly listening and occasionally offering gentle rebuttals that were clearly falling on deaf ears. When she finally hung up, She stood with her back to me for a long moment before turning around. Her eyes were bright with unshed tears, but there was also anger there, a spark of righteous indignation that I was glad to see. "I'm sorry you had to hear that," she said, attempting a smile that fooled neither of us. "You don't need to apologize for having a daughter who's concerned about you." Concerned? Sydney's voice carried a bitter edge I'd never heard before. "Rosalie heard about you from Nella. Apparently the entire family is scandalized by my poor judgment and thinks I'm making a fool of myself by befriending someone so much younger. According to them, I'm either being manipulated or having some kind of pathetic midlife crisis that's embarrassing the family name." I felt anger rising in my chest, not at Sydney, but at the people who were supposed to love and support her, but instead seemed determined to keep her small and ashamed. "What did you tell her?" "The truth. That you're a good friend who's helped me remember what it feels like to have conversations about things I actually care about. That you see me as a person worth listening to." She set down her water glass with more force than necessary, but she doesn't want to hear that. She wants me to go back to being the invisible, grateful woman who doesn't make waves or have opinions or form connections that might complicate her tidy narrative about our family. "And what do you want?" Sydney was quiet for a long moment, wrestling with something deeper than just family disapproval. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I want to stop apologizing for taking up space in the world. I want to stop feeling like I have to justify every friendship, every interest, every moment of happiness." She looked directly at me, tears finally spilling over. "But I'm terrified that maybe they're right. Maybe I am just a lonely, middle-aged woman who's reading too much into a simple kindness from a neighbor." The vulnerability in her voice broke something open in my chest. I stood up and moved towards her, careful not to invade her space, but wanting her to see the sincerity in my eyes. "Sydney, look at me," I said gently. When she did, I continued. "You are not making a fool of yourself. You are not a charity case. You are not someone I spend time with out of pity or obligation, or because I have nothing better to do." "Then why?" she asked, her voice cracking. "What could you possibly get from being friends with me that you couldn't find with people your own age?" I considered the question seriously, wanting to give her an answer that was both honest and meaningful. "You want to know what I get from our friendship? I get to spend time with someone who notices things. The way morning light transforms her garden, how a neighbor's decorations tell an ongoing story. What makes conversation meaningful versus just noise. I get to be around someone who's brave enough to admit when she's scared or confused, instead of pretending everything is perfect. I get to watch someone rediscover parts of herself she'd almost forgotten existed." Tears were streaming down Sydney's face now, but she didn't look away. "Most importantly," I continued, "I get to be completely myself with you in a way I haven't been able to be with anyone in years. You don't need me to be impressive or successful or anything other than exactly who I am. Do you have any idea how rare that is?" Sydney wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, a small smile breaking through her tears. "I don't feel very remarkable most days." "Then we need to work on that," I said firmly. "Because you are remarkable, and anyone who can't see that, including your daughter, is missing out on knowing an extraordinary person." For the first time since the phone call, Sydney's smile reached her eyes. "Thank you for not giving up on me. Thank you for not giving up on yourself." Things were going well, too well as it turned out. Sydney had been painting again, filling her house with watercolor landscapes that captured the changing Colorado seasons with surprising skill. She'd started volunteering at the local animal shelter, something she mentioned had always interested her, but that David had deemed inappropriate for someone in his position. Our friendship had settled into a comfortable rhythm that felt natural and sustaining. Then everything changed on a Tuesday morning in late February. I was finishing up a snow removal job when my phone rang. Sydney's name flashed on the screen, but when I answered, the voice I heard was barely recognizable. Shaky, panicked, nothing. Like the confident woman I'd been having coffee with just that morning. "Marcus," she whispered, and I could hear she was crying. "Something's happened. I don't know who else to call." "I'm on my way," I said, already loading my equipment into the truck. "Whatever it is, we'll figure it out." When I arrived, At Sydney's house, I found her sitting on her front steps in nothing but a bathrobe and slippers, despite the freezing temperature. Her face was pale, her eyes red-rimmed with shock and disbelief. "Sydney, what's wrong?" I asked, immediately shrugging off my jacket and wrapping it around her shoulders. "What happened?" She looked up at me with an expression of complete devastation. "They're taking the house, Marcus. They're taking everything." I helped her inside, noting that her usually pristine living room was scattered with papers, official-looking documents spread across every surface. Her hands shook as she picked up a thick manila envelope. "This came this morning," she said, her voice hollow. "Certified mail. I thought it was something routine, maybe tax documents or insurance paperwork." She laughed bitterly. I was wrong. I scanned the papers she handed me, trying to make sense of the legal language. What I saw made my stomach drop. David, her ex-husband, had apparently been running some kind of investment scheme that had finally collapsed. The victims were suing not just him, but everything connected to his assets, including the house that had been awarded to Sydney in their divorce settlement. "I don't understand," Sydney said, her voice breaking. "How can they take my house? It's been mine for 2 years. The divorce decree says—" "The divorce decree doesn't matter if the assets were acquired through fraudulent means," I said quietly, hating that I had to explain this to her. "If they can prove that David used stolen money to buy this house originally, then I lose everything," she finished. "My home, my garden, my paintings, everything I've built since the divorce." She stood up abruptly and walked to the window overlooking her beloved garden, now covered in snow. 20 years, Marcus. I spent 20 years married to a man who was apparently a criminal, and I never knew. How is that possible? How could I have been so blind? The self-recrimination in her voice was painful to hear. "Sydney, this isn't your fault. You can't blame yourself for not seeing something David deliberately hid from you." "Can't I?" She turned, back to me, anger and pain warring in her expression. "I lived with him for 2 decades. I shared a bed with him, ate meals with him, attended his business functions, and I never once suspected that he was stealing from people? What does that say about me?" Before I could answer, the doorbell rang. Sydney's whole body tensed, and I could see her fighting the urge to hide. "I'll get it," I said. But Sydney shook her head. "No. If this is my life falling apart, I need to face it myself." The man at the door introduced himself as Stephen Archer, David's former business partner. He was tall, well-dressed, and carried himself with the kind of aggressive confidence that immediately put me on edge. "Sydney," he said, not bothering with pleasantries. "I assume you've seen the documents." "I've seen them," she replied, her voice steadier than I'd expected. "Good. Then you understand the situation. David's victims have a right to recover their losses, and unfortunately, that includes this property." His tone was matter-of-fact, as if he was discussing the weather rather than destroying someone's life. "This house was awarded to me in the divorce," Sydney said. "I had nothing to do with David's business dealings." Stephen shrugged. "The courts will decide that. In the meantime, I'm here to inform you that you have 30 days to vacate. I'd suggest you start making arrangements." I stepped forward, unable to stay silent any longer. "Wait a minute. You can't just show up here and demand she leave her own house based on some accusations." "Actually, I can," Stephen interrupted, his gaze flicking dismissively over me before returning to Sydney. "The preliminary injunction was granted this morning. Sydney, I know this is difficult, but dragging this out will only make things worse for everyone." After he left, Sydney collapsed onto her couch as if all the strength had drained out of her. The papers scattered around her suddenly looked less like documents and more like weapons, each one designed to tear apart the life she'd worked so hard to rebuild. 30 days, she said numbly. How am I supposed to find a new place to live, pack up everything I own, and somehow rebuild my entire life again in 30 days? I sat down beside her, careful not to crowd her but wanting her to know she wasn't alone. "We'll figure it out. You're not doing this by yourself." She looked at me with a mixture of gratitude and despair. "Marcus, you don't understand. I don't have anywhere to go. Rosalie made it clear she doesn't want me disrupting her life, and I can't afford much on my divorce settlement, especially if they freeze those assets too." Her voice grew smaller. I'm 53 years old, and I'm about to be homeless." The word hung in the air between us, stark and terrifying. I watched this strong, intelligent woman grapple with the reality that everything she thought was secure was being stripped away from her through no fault of her own. "What about David?" I asked. "Where is he in all this?" Sydney's laugh was bitter. "David disappeared 3 months ago. His law firm claims they have no idea where he went, and apparently, he cleaned out all their joint accounts before he left. He knew this was coming, Marcus. He knew, and he didn't warn me." The betrayal in her voice was devastating. It was one thing to discover your ex-husband was a criminal. It was another to realize he'd deliberately left you to face the consequences of his actions alone. "I keep thinking about all those political events," Sydney continued, staring at the ceiling. "All those fundraisers where I smiled and made small talk with these important people. How many of them were David's victims? How many people did I unknowingly help him deceive?" "Sydney, stop. You're not responsible for David's choices, aren't I?" She turned to me, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "I was his wife. I benefited from his success. I lived in this house, drove cars he bought, wore jewelry he gave me. If all of that was paid for with stolen money, then what does that make me?" I could see her spiraling, the guilt and shame threatening to overwhelm the progress she'd made in rebuilding her sense of self-worth. This wasn't just about losing her house. It was about losing her entire understanding of her own life and identity. "It makes you another one of his victims," I said firmly. "And victims don't deserve to be punished for their abuser's crimes." But even as I said it, I could see that Sydney wasn't ready to hear it. The shock was too fresh, the betrayal too deep. The woman who had been slowly learning to trust herself again was suddenly questioning everything she thought she knew about her own judgment and worth, and I realized that this crisis was going to test not just Sydney's resilience, but the foundation of our friendship itself. The week following Stephen Archer's visit was a blur of legal consultations, frantic phone calls, and sleepless nights. Sydney had thrown herself into understanding her situation with the same methodical intensity she brought to everything else. But I could see the toll it was taking. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, and she'd lost weight she couldn't afford to lose. I'd been spending most of my free time at her house, helping her sort through documents and making lists of what needed to be done. We were sitting at her kitchen table on a Friday evening, surrounded by bankers' boxes and legal pads covered in Sydney's careful handwriting, when she suddenly stopped mid-sentence. "Marcus," she said, her voice strange. "Look at this." She was holding a folder I hadn't seen before, one that had been buried beneath a stack of tax documents. The tab was labeled, "Personal, Do Not Open," in David's distinctive handwriting. "Where did that come from?" I asked. "It was taped to the bottom of the file cabinet drawer," Sydney said, her hands shaking slightly. "I only found it because I was emptying everything out for the move." She opened the folder carefully, as if it might contain something that could hurt her. Inside were documents that immediately looked different from the legal and financial papers we'd been reviewing. Personal. Letters, photographs, and what appeared to be a safety deposit box key. "These photos," Sydney whispered, pulling out a small stack of pictures. "I've never seen them before." I moved closer to look. The photographs showed David with various people in what looked like private meetings. Handshakes in parking garages, conversations in dimly lit restaurants, exchanges of briefcases. The images had a secretive, almost sinister quality that made my skin crawl. "Who are these people?" Sydney asked, though her voice suggested she wasn't sure she wanted to know. Before I could answer, we heard the sound of a car pulling into Sydney's driveway. We both froze, the paranoia of the past week making every unexpected visitor feel like a potential threat. "Are you expecting anyone?" I asked. Sydney shook her head, quickly closing the folder and sliding it under a stack of other papers. "Stay here," she said. But I was already following her to the front door. Through the window, we could see a woman getting out of a small sedan, someone neither of us recognized. She was middle-aged, professionally dressed, but there was something urgent about her movements as she approached the house. "Sydney Jameson?" the woman asked when Sydney opened the door. "My name is Lila Morrison. I was your husband's accountant." The word "was" hung in the air with obvious significance. "I don't understand," Sydney said. David's accountant was Robert Chen. I met him several times at office parties. Lila shook her head grimly. Robert handled David's legitimate business. I handled the other things. The things he didn't want anyone else to know about. Sydney and I exchanged glances. This was clearly not a conversation for the front doorstep. "Please, come in," Sydney said, though I could hear the reluctance in her voice. Once we were seated in the living room, Lila got straight to the point. "I know about the lawsuit. I know they're trying to take your house. And I know David left you to face this alone." Her voice carried a mixture of anger and guilt. "I can't live with that." "What do you mean?" Sydney asked. "I mean, I have information that could change everything. David wasn't just stealing from clients. He was being blackmailed. The real criminal in this situation isn't your ex-husband. It's the man who showed up at your door last week." The room went dead silent. Stephen Archer, the man who delivered Sydney's eviction notice with such cold efficiency, was apparently not just David's former business partner. "Stephen Archer has been running an extortion ring for years," Lila continued. "He identifies successful professionals with secrets, affairs, gambling debts, tax irregularities, and then squeezes them for money. David got caught up in it 3 years ago." "What kind of secret did David have?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know. Lila's expression grew uncomfortable. "David had been having an affair with one of his law clerks. Stephen found out and threatened to expose it unless David started funneling client money through fake investment accounts. At first, it was small amounts. Money Stephen claimed was for insurance to keep David's secret safe." Sydney's face had gone white. "But David divorced me. Why would he care about hiding an affair if he was already planning to leave?" "Because the affair started 5 years before he left you," Lila said gently. "Stephen had leverage over David for much longer than you knew. By the time David finally decided to end the marriage, he was already in too deep to get out." I felt a surge of anger on Sydney's behalf. Not only had David betrayed her with multiple affairs, but he'd made her an unwitting accomplice to his crimes while keeping her completely in the dark. "So David was a victim too?" Sydney asked, her voice hollow. "In some ways, yes. But that doesn't excuse what he did. David could have come clean at any point, could have gone to the police, could have told you the truth. Instead, he chose to protect himself and leave you to face the consequences." Sydney stood up abruptly and walked to the window, her back to us. "Why are you telling me this now?" she asked. "What do you want from me?" "I want to help you fight back," Lila said firmly. "I have records, documents, proof of Stephen's extortion activities. But I need your help to expose him." "What kind of help?" I asked, not liking where this was heading. Lila pulled out a business card and placed it on the coffee table. "There's an FBI agent named Caleb Turner who's been investigating Stephen for years. He's been trying to build a case, but he needs someone on the inside, someone Stephen trusts." "Stephen doesn't trust me," Sydney said without turning around. "He barely knows me." "But he thinks he does," Lila countered. "He thinks you're just David's naive ex-wife who doesn't know anything about the business. He's not expecting you to fight back." Sydney finally turned around, and I could see something new in her expression. Not just fear and confusion, but a flicker of anger that hadn't been there before. "You're asking me to help catch the man who's destroying my life," she said slowly. "I'm asking you to help catch the man who destroyed a lot of lives, including yours and David's," Lila replied. "And in the process, we might be able to prove that you're an innocent victim in all this, which could save your house." The folder with the mysterious photographs suddenly took on new significance. If David had been documenting his meetings with Stephen and others, those images might be evidence of the extortion ring Lila was describing. "Sydney," I said carefully, "this sounds dangerous. Getting involved in an FBI investigation, trying to entrap someone like Stephen Archer. What's the alternative?" Sydney interrupted. "I lose everything anyway, and Stephen moves on to destroying someone else's life?" She picked up Lila's business card, studying it as if it might contain answers to questions she hadn't even thought to ask yet. "If I do this," Sydney said finally, "if I help this FBI agent build a case against Stephen, what guarantee do I have that it will actually save my house?" "No guarantee," Lila admitted. But it's the only chance you've got. Without this, Stephen gets away with everything, and you're just another casualty of his operation." As Lila prepared to leave, she turned back to Sydney with an expression of genuine remorse. "I'm sorry I didn't come forward sooner. I was scared and I told myself it wasn't my responsibility. But watching what's happening to you, I couldn't stay silent anymore." After she left, Sydney and I sat in stunned silence, the weight of this new information settling over us like a heavy blanket. 24 hours ago, I thought I was the victim of my ex-husband's crimes, Sydney said quietly. Now, I find out I'm the victim of someone else's crimes entirely, and David was being blackmailed the whole time. She looked at me with an expression that mixed exhaustion, determination, and something that might have been hope. "Marcus, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Always. If I do this, if I help the FBI try to catch Stephen Archer, will you help me? Even if it gets complicated, even if it gets dangerous?" I looked at this woman who had become so important to me, who was facing the fight of her life with more courage than she probably realized she possessed. "Sydney," I said, "I'm not going anywhere." The meeting with FBI agent Caleb Turner took place 3 days later at a coffee shop across town, far from Maplewood Heights, where neighbors might recognize Sydney. I'd insisted on coming with her, despite her protests that I was getting too involved in something dangerous. "This could get complicated, Marcus," she'd said as we drove across the city. "If you're seen with me, if Stephen finds out you're involved, you could become a target too." "I'm already involved," I'd replied firmly. "The moment I chose to care about you, I became involved." Agent Turner was younger than I'd expected, probably in his mid-30s, with the kind of intense focus that came from years of hunting people who thought they were untouchable. He listened carefully as Sydney explained her situation, occasionally asking clarifying questions but mostly just absorbing information. "Ms. Morrison was right to send you to me," he said finally. "We've been building a case against Stephen Archer for 2 years, but he's careful, very careful. Most of his victims are too scared or too ashamed to come forward." "What exactly would you need me to do?" Sydney asked, her hands wrapped tightly around her coffee cup. "Stephen still sees you as David's naive ex-wife," Turner explained. "He believes you don't know anything about the real business dealings. That gives us an advantage." He pulled out a small recording device. "We need evidence of Stephen's extortion activities, recordings of him admitting to blackmail, threatening, behavior, anything that shows the pattern of criminal activity." Sydney stared at the device as if it were a snake. "You want me to wear a wire?" "Initially, just in conversations you're already having with him. Stephen will likely contact you again as the eviction date approaches. When he does, we need you to ask questions that might lead him to reveal information about his operation." I felt my stomach tighten with worry. What if he gets suspicious? What if he realizes she's recording him? Turner's expression grew serious. "That's the risk. Stephen Archer is not someone you want to underestimate. He's destroyed lives, ruined careers, and according to our investigation, he may have been involved in at least one suspicious death. A lawyer who was threatening to expose him." The color drained from Sydney's face. "Someone died? We can't prove it yet, but yes, we believe Stephen has escalated beyond financial extortion when necessary." Turner leaned forward. "I need you to understand the full scope of what you'd be taking on. This isn't just about saving your house anymore. This is about stopping a predator who will continue hurting people until someone stands up to him." The weight of that responsibility settled over Sydney like a heavy cloak. I could see her wrestling with the decision, torn between her desire for justice and her very reasonable fear of the consequences. "If I do this," she said slowly, "what protection can you offer me?" "Limited," Turner admitted. "We can't provide round-the-clock security without compromising the investigation, but we'll be monitoring your communications and we'll have agents nearby during any planned meetings." As we drove home from the meeting, Sydney was quiet, staring out the window at the passing scenery. I could practically hear the gears turning, in her mind, weighing options that all seemed to carry enormous risks. "What are you thinking?" I asked finally. "I'm thinking about what Lila said, that David could have come clean at any point but chose to protect himself instead." She turned to look at me. I don't want to be like David. I don't want to choose the safe path if it means other people get hurt. But you also don't want to get yourself killed trying to be a hero. She was quiet for another moment. Marcus, can I ask you something? Always. If something happens to me, if this goes wrong somehow, will you make sure people know the truth? About David? About Stephen? About what really happened? The question hit me like a physical blow. Sydney, nothing's going to happen to you. We're not going to let it. But if it does, she insisted, will you promise me? I pulled over to the side of the road and turned to face her fully. I promise. But I also promise that I'm not going to let you do this alone. That night, Sydney called Agent Turner and agreed to cooperate with the investigation. The recording device was delivered the next morning by a woman posing as a pharmaceutical sales representative. She also brought a small panic button disguised as a car key fob. Press and hold for 3 seconds, she explained. It sends a GPS signal directly to Agent Turner and the nearest field office. Use it only in genuine emergencies. Once you activate it, we have to assume your cover is blown. The waiting began then. Tense days of Sydney going about her normal routine while expecting Stephen Archer to make contact. I found excuses to be around her house more often, supposedly working on various landscaping projects, but really just wanting to be nearby if something went wrong. It was during one of these anxious days that our quiet neighborhood support system emerged in unexpected ways. Theo Kellerman, the elderly man who lived across the street, knocked on Sydney's door one afternoon with a concerned expression. "Sydney, dear," he said when she answered. "I hope you don't mind me asking, but is everything all right? I've noticed some unfamiliar cars parked on the street lately, and that man in the expensive suit who was here last week looked like he was delivering bad news." Sydney glanced at me. I was supposedly fixing her garden gate, but was actually listening to every word. We'd agreed to keep the investigation secret, but Theo's observation skills were sharper than we'd realized. "There have been some legal complications," Sydney said carefully. "Nothing dangerous, just paperwork issues related to my divorce." Theo nodded, but his expression suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. "Well, if you need anything at all, Martha and I are right across the street. We've lived in this neighborhood for 37 years, and we look out for our own." After he left, Sydney sank onto her porch steps. "I hate lying to him. He's been nothing but kind to me since I moved here." "You're not lying," I said, sitting down beside her. "You're protecting him. If Theo knew what was really going on, he'd want to help, and that could put him in danger too." The irony wasn't lost on either of us. Sydney, who had spent years feeling invisible and disconnected from her community, was now discovering how much her neighbors actually cared about her at the exact moment when she couldn't tell them why. She needed their support. The call from Stephen finally came on a Thursday evening. Sydney's phone rang just as we were finishing dinner, and when she saw his name on the caller ID, her hand trembled slightly as she reached for the recording device. "Sydney." Stephen's voice was smooth, professional. "I hope you're making progress with your moving arrangements. I wanted to check in and see if you have any questions about the timeline." "Actually, I do have some questions," Sydney said, her voice steadier than I'd expected. "I've been reviewing the documents, and I'm confused about some of the dates. The investment account that supposedly contains stolen money. According to these papers, David opened it before we were even married." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "I'm not sure I understand your point." "My point is that if David was stealing money before our marriage, then how can you claim that our house was purchased with fraudulent funds? We bought the house with my inheritance from my grandmother." Another pause, longer this time. When Stephen spoke again, his tone had shifted slightly, becoming more guarded. "Sydney, I think there may be some confusion about the timeline. Perhaps we should meet in person to go over the details." Sydney looked at me, her eyes wide. This was it. The moment that would determine whether we moved forward with the investigation or found another way to fight Stephen's claims. "That sounds like a good idea," she said. "When would be convenient for you?" As they arranged to meet the following day, I felt a mixture of pride and terror. Sydney was being brave. Braver than anyone should have to be. But I also knew that tomorrow would change everything, one way or another. The game was about to begin, and the stakes couldn't be higher. The morning of Sydney's meeting with Stephen, I woke up before dawn with my stomach in knots. Sydney had insisted on staying at her house the night before, wanting to maintain her normal routine, but I'd barely slept knowing what she was about to face. I arrived at her house at 7 a.m. to find her already dressed and pacing her kitchen, recording device clipped discreetly inside her jacket. She looked pale but determined, like someone preparing for surgery, scared but resolved to see it through. "The meeting is at his office downtown at 10, she said, pouring coffee with hands that only trembled slightly. "Agent Turner says they'll have surveillance teams positioned around the building, but once I'm inside, you'll be on your own," I finished. "Sydney, it's not too late to change your mind." She looked at me with a sad smile. "Yes, it is. Stephen is expecting me to be the helpless victim, remember? If I don't show up, he'll know something has changed." At 9:30, I drove Sydney to within 2 blocks of Stephen's office building. Agent Turner had insisted she arrive alone to avoid suspicion, but he'd arranged for me to wait at a coffee shop across the street where I could see the building entrance. "Remember," I said as she got out of the car, "stick to the script. Ask about the timeline inconsistencies, but don't push too hard if he deflects. The goal is to get him talking, not to interrogate him." Sydney nodded, then leaned back through the car window. "Marcus, if something happens to me, nothing is going to happen to you," I said firmly. "You're going to go in there, have a conversation, and come back out. That's it." But as I watched her walk toward the building, her small figure disappearing into the crowd of downtown pedestrians, I felt like I was watching someone I cared about walk into a lion's den. The next hour was the longest of my life. I sat in the coffee shop, my phone in my hand, jumping every time it buzzed with a text or call that wasn't from Sydney. Agent Turner had given me a number to call if anything seemed wrong. But what would wrong look like from across the street? 11:15, my phone finally rang. Sydney's name appeared on the screen, and I answered before the first ring finished. "I'm out," she said, her voice shaky but controlled. "I'm walking toward the coffee shop now." When she slid into the booth across from me 5 minutes later, she looked like she'd aged years in the past hour. Her hands were trembling, and there was a haunted quality in her eyes that made my chest tighten with worry. "How did it go?" I asked gently. Sydney pulled out the recording device and set it on the table between us. "He talked, Marcus. He talked. A lot." Her voice was a mixture of triumph and terror. "But I think he suspects something." "What do you mean?" The questions I was asking, about the timeline, about David's accounts, Stephen got defensive. He started asking me why I was suddenly so interested in the details, whether someone had been helping me review the documents. She wrapped her hands around her coffee cup. I told him I'd hired a lawyer, but I don't think he believed me. What exactly did he say that was incriminating? Sydney took a shaky breath. He admitted that David wasn't the one who initiated the investment scheme. He said David had been reluctant to participate, until Stephen convinced him it was necessary. And when I pressed him about what kind of convincing, he implied there were consequences for people who didn't cooperate with his recommendations. That sounds like a pretty clear admission of extortion. "It gets worse," Sydney continued. "When I mentioned that I was thinking about fighting the asset seizure in court, Stephen got very cold. He said that would be inadvisable, and that people who made things difficult for him often found their situations becoming much more complicated." The implicit threat in Stephen's words made my blood run cold. This wasn't just about money anymore. Sydney had potentially put herself in real physical danger. "What did you tell him?" "That I just wanted to understand my options. But Marcus, the way he looked at me when I left..." She shivered. "It was like he was seeing me differently. Like he was reassessing everything he thought he knew about me." My phone buzzed with a text from Agent Turner. "Need to debrief immediately. Same location as yesterday." "Turner wants to meet," I told Sydney. "We need to get this recording to him right away." But as we prepared to leave the coffee shop, Sydney grabbed my arm. "Marcus, there's something else. Something I didn't tell you." "What?" "While I was in Stephen's office, I saw something on his desk, a folder with my name on it. Not just my name, but information about you too. He knows about our friendship. He knows you've been helping me." The implication hit me like a physical blow. If Stephen saw me as a threat to his operation, then I wasn't just Sydney's support system anymore. I was potentially his next target. The emergency meeting with Agent Turner felt different this time. Instead of the calm, controlled atmosphere of our previous encounters, there was an urgency in his movements as he listened to the recording of Sydney's conversation with Stephen Archer. "This is excellent work," Turner said, rewinding the device to replay Stephen's implicit threats. His admission about David being reluctant to participate and his warning about people who make things complicated. This is exactly the kind of evidence we need to build a pattern of extortion. But his expression grew serious when Sydney told him about the folder with our names. That changes things significantly. If Stephen suspects you're working with law enforcement, we need to move faster than planned. "What does that mean?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know. Turner pulled out his phone and made a quick call, speaking in code to someone about accelerating the timeline. When he hung up, he looked directly at Sydney. "We're going to set up a final meeting with Stephen. One where we can get him to fully reveal his operation. But it's going to be riskier than anything you've done so far." "How much riskier?" Sydney's voice was steady, but I could see the fear in her eyes. "We want you to tell Stephen that you've found something, documents or evidence that could expose his entire network. Tell him you're willing to trade this information for your house and your freedom from his harassment." I felt my blood run cold. "You want to use her as bait?" "In essence, yes," Turner admitted. "Stephen's operation depends on secrecy. If he believes Sydney has evidence that could destroy him, he'll have to act. The question is whether he'll try to buy her silence or eliminate the threat entirely." Sydney was quiet for a long moment, processing the implications. "And you'll be recording everything?" "We'll have multiple surveillance teams, audio and video recording, and backup agents positioned throughout the location. But Sydney, I need you to understand. If Stephen decides you're too dangerous to let live, things could escalate very quickly." The weight of what Turner was asking settled over the room like a suffocating blanket. This wasn't just about wearing a wire anymore. This was about deliberately provoking a dangerous criminal and hoping the FBI could protect Sydney if things went wrong. "Where would this meeting take place?" I asked. "Somewhere public, but private enough for Stephen to speak freely. We're thinking the parking garage of his office building, late evening when most people have gone home." Sydney stood up and walked to the window, staring out at the city skyline. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "All these years, I thought the worst thing that could happen to me was being alone, being invisible, having no one care whether I lived or died." She turned back to us. "But sitting here, listening to you plan how to use me to catch a killer, I realize I was wrong. The worst thing would be letting Stephen continue to destroy other people's lives because I was too scared to stop him. Sydney, you don't have to do this," I said urgently. "There has to be another way." She looked at me with a sad smile. "Marcus, 3 months ago, I was a woman hiding in her perfect house, afraid to even go to the farmer's market alone. Now I'm sitting here planning to confront a criminal who's been destroying lives for years. Maybe this is who I was always meant to be." Turner's phone buzzed with a text. He read it quickly, then looked up with an expression that made my stomach drop. "What is it?" Sydney asked. "We just got word that Lila Morrison, David's accountant who came to you, was found dead in her apartment this morning. The police are calling it a suicide, but given the timing..." The room went silent. The woman who had risked everything to expose Stephen's operation was dead, and we all knew it wasn't a coincidence. Sydney sank back into her chair, the color draining from her face. "He killed her." "We don't know that for certain," Turner said, carefully. "But it reinforces why we need to move quickly. Stephen is clearly eliminating potential witnesses." "Then I'm already dead," Sydney said quietly. "If he killed Lila for talking to the FBI, what's to stop him from killing me?" "Because you're still useful to him," Turner explained. "As long as Stephen believes he can control the situation, either by buying your silence or intimidating you into compliance, you're safe. But if he realizes you're actively working against him..." The implication hung in the air unfinished. Sydney looked at both of us, her expression a mixture of terror and determination. "When do we do this?" "Tomorrow night," Turner said. "We'll stage it to look like you discovered something in David's safety deposit box, something that connects Stephen to other victims, other crimes. Make him believe you have enough evidence to destroy his entire operation. As we prepared to leave the meeting, Turner pulled me aside. Marcus, I need you to understand something. After tomorrow night, regardless of how this goes, Sydney's life is going to change forever. If we succeed, she'll be a key witness in a major federal prosecution. If we fail... He didn't finish the sentence. You're asking me to let the person I care about most walk into a death trap. I'm asking you to trust that we can protect her. But I'm also asking you to be prepared for the possibility that we can't. That night, as Sydney and I sat in her kitchen, making final preparations, she turned to me with an expression I'd never seen before. Peaceful, almost serene. Marcus, I need you to know something, she said. Whatever happens tomorrow, these past few months with you have been the happiest of my adult life. You helped me remember who I was before David, before the fear, before I disappeared into someone else's idea of who I should be. Sydney, let me finish, she said gently. I'm 53 years old, and I've never been touched the way you touch me. Not physically, but emotionally. You see me. Really see me. And that's a gift I never thought I'd have. As those words hung in the air between us, I realized that tomorrow wasn't just about catching Stephen Archer or saving Sydney's house. It was about whether the woman who had become the most important person in my world would survive to build the life she'd finally learned she deserved. The parking garage felt like a tomb as Sydney walked toward the meeting point where Stephen Archer was waiting. From my position in the surveillance van with Agent Turner, I could see her small figure moving confidently across the concrete expanse, the tiny recording devices hidden in her jewelry capturing every sound. She's incredible, Turner murmured into his headset as he watched Sydney approach Stephen's Mercedes. Most seasoned undercover agents would be terrified right now. Through the directional microphone, we could hear Sydney's voice, steady and clear. Stephen, thank you for meeting me on such short notice. I found something in David's safety deposit box that I think you need to see. Stephen's response was wary. What kind of something? Records, photographs, documentation of meetings with other clients, people I recognize from political events David and I attended. It appears my ex-husband kept very detailed files about your business relationship. There was a long pause. When Stephen spoke again, his voice had changed, becoming harder, more dangerous. Sydney, I think you may be misunderstanding the nature of those documents. Am I? Because it looks to me like you've been blackmailing professionals all over the state for years. David wasn't your only victim, was he? My heart was pounding as I watched the confrontation unfold. Sydney was being braver than anyone had the right to ask of her, pushing Stephen exactly as Turner had instructed while standing alone with a man who had potentially killed to protect his secrets. You're playing a very dangerous game, Stephen said, his voice low and menacing. People who think they can threaten me often find that their problems multiply quickly. Is that what happened to Lila Morrison? Sydney asked, and I could hear the steel in her voice. Did her problems multiply when she decided to talk to the FBI? The silence that followed was deafening. When Stephen finally spoke, there was no pretense left, no careful language or legal protection. Lila forgot that loyalty is a survival skill, just like David forgot. Just like you seem to be forgetting. His voice was cold, matter of fact. But I'm a reasonable man, Sydney. Give me those documents, forget whatever foolish ideas you have about exposing anything, and we can end this conversation with your continued good health. And if I refuse, then you'll discover that women your age can be surprisingly fragile. Accidents happen, home invasions, heart attacks brought on by stress. The possibilities are really quite numerous. Turner was already signaling to the tactical teams positioned throughout the garage. This was it. Stephen had just confessed to murder and threatened Sydney's life on a recording that would put him away forever. But something went wrong. Stephen's head snapped up, his predator instinct suddenly alert. You're wearing a wire, he said, his voice deadly quiet. The next few seconds felt like hours. Stephen lunged towards Sydney, and I watched in horror as she stumbled backward, reaching for the panic button hidden in her jacket. The tactical team was moving, but they were still 30 seconds away from reaching her. Then Sydney did something that changed everything. Instead of running or cowering, she stood her ground and looked Stephen Archer directly in the eyes. You want to know the difference between you and me? She said, her voice carrying across the parking garage with startling clarity. I spent 20 years being afraid of not being good enough, afraid of not being loved, afraid of being alone. But you know what I learned? Being afraid of the wrong things will kill you faster than any bullet. Stephen paused, confused by her response. I'm 53 years old, Sydney continued, and I haven't been touched by genuine human connection in years, until a young man named Marcus showed me what it means to be seen and valued for who I really am. You can threaten my life, Stephen, but you can't threaten my spirit anymore. I already know who I am, and I'm not afraid of you. The tactical team reached them before Stephen could respond, surrounding him with weapons drawn. As the handcuffs clicked into place, I heard him screaming about entrapment and illegal surveillance, but his words were lost in the chaos of his arrest. Sydney stood in the middle of it all, watching Stephen being led away. And I realized that somewhere in this terrifying confrontation, she had found something she'd been searching for her entire adult life, the courage to stand up for herself and others, regardless of the consequences. When the dust settled and Stephen was in custody, Turner approached Sydney with something approaching awe. That was either the bravest or the most reckless thing I've ever witnessed, he said. But it worked. We have everything we need to put Stephen away for life and exonerate you completely. Sydney smiled, but she was looking past Turner toward the surveillance van where I was climbing out, desperate to reach her. The house? She asked. Yours to keep. The court will reverse the asset seizure order within the week. But as I reached Sydney and pulled her into my arms, I realized that saving her house had become secondary to something much more important. We had both discovered that sometimes the greatest courage comes not from facing death, but from choosing to fully embrace life and each other. 6 months later, I found myself sitting on Sydney's back patio, watching her work in the garden she had nearly lost. The morning sun filtered through the trees, casting dancing shadows across the flower beds that had become more beautiful than ever. Sydney moved among her plants with a confidence I'd never seen before. Not the careful perfection of someone trying to maintain control, but the relaxed joy of someone who had finally learned to trust herself. The tomatoes are coming in beautifully this year, she called over to me, holding up a cluster of bright red fruit. I think it's because I stopped trying to force them to grow the way I thought they should. I smiled at the metaphor. Sydney had developed a habit of finding life lessons in her garden, and I'd learned to listen for the deeper meanings in her observations about plants and soil and seasons. The house had been officially returned to her 3 weeks after Stephen's arrest. The legal proceedings had moved quickly once the FBI had Stephen's recorded confessions and the evidence from David's hidden files. Stephen Archer was facing multiple federal charges including extortion, conspiracy, and suspected murder. David, who had been located hiding in Mexico, had agreed to testify against Stephen in exchange for a reduced sentence. But more important than the legal victories was the transformation I witnessed in Sydney every day. The woman who had once been afraid to go to the farmer's market alone was now volunteering as a victim's advocate, helping other people navigate the aftermath of financial crimes. She'd started painting again, not just watercolors of landscapes, but bold, expressive pieces that local galleries were eager to display. Marcus, she said, setting down her gardening tools and walking over to where I sat. I got a call from Agent Turner this morning. Stephen accepted a plea deal. 25 years without parole. How do you feel about that? She considered the question, settling into the chair beside me. Relieved, grateful, and proud, I think. Proud that I didn't let fear make my decisions for me. We sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, listening to the sounds of the neighborhood coming to life around us. Theo Kellerman was mowing his lawn across the street, and I could hear children playing in a nearby yard. Normal sounds of a normal life. The kind of peaceful existence Sydney had created for herself not by hiding from the world, but by finding the courage to engage with it fully. You know what the strangest part is? Sydney said eventually. What's that? A year ago, I would have said the worst thing that could happen to me was having my life turned upside down, losing my house, facing danger, having to start over again. She looked at me with eyes that sparkled with something I could only describe as joy. But all of that chaos led me to the best thing that's ever happened to me. Your newfound confidence? No, she said, reaching over to take my hand. You, us, this. She was right, of course. What had started as a simple request to fix a broken sprinkler system had evolved into something neither of us could have predicted. We weren't just neighbors anymore, or even just friends. We were two people who had found in each other what we hadn't even known we were looking for: acceptance, understanding, and the rare gift of being truly seen. "I love you, Sydney," I said. Words I'd been wanting to say for months, finally finding their way out. "I love you too," she replied without hesitation. And for the first time in my 53 years, I'm not afraid of what that means. As I looked at this remarkable woman who had taught me that courage isn't the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it, I realized that sometimes the most important repairs aren't the ones you make to broken appliances or irrigation systems. Sometimes the most important repairs are the ones you make to broken hearts, broken dreams, and broken faith in the possibility of connection and hope. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, those repairs end up fixing you too. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.